We're talking about an entire movement dedicated to promoting the legitimization of abortion. And that raises this struggle to an entirely different plateau of wickedness. Welcome. My name is Rabbi Noson Leiter with Help Rescue Our Children and Torah Jews for Decency, and I would like to offer the esteemed listeners a few words from a perspective of a Torah observant Jew who has been active in this issue of abortion for not years, I would say decades. First, I'd like to start off just with a brief summary of the Torah perspective on the act of abortion itself, which, as many may know, is prohibited according to Jewish law without any question whatsoever. In fact, it's prohibited for non-Jews as well. It's part of the Noahide Code of Laws. It's one of the 7 prohibitions that are incumbent on the entirety of humanity. In fact, as Maimonides states in the Mishnah Torah in Hilchos Malachim Laws of Kings, chapter 9, law 4, that it is a capital offense for all mankind under the rubric of the Noahide laws. And as far as various exceptions that may apply that are commonly discussed in the public sphere, the listeners should be aware that these are generally non-relevant. And the reason is as follows. The primary exception that there is, we find in Jewish law, is to save the mother's life. And for the simple reason that with modern medical advances, at least in countries like the United States, oftentimes it's most effective to save the mother's life, to save the baby through a C-section, rather than go through the abortion process, which takes a lot longer and often endangers the mother. For that reason, the whole discussion of the danger of the mother's life, which again, according to Jewish law, in practice is really the only noteworthy exception to talk about, that's really off the table, again, because of modern medical advances. With regard to others that bring up various other exceptions, first of all, those are rare. Even the most lenient, the views that we would consider perhaps within the rubric of Jewish law, authentic Jewish law, or perhaps on the borderline, whichever side of the borderline they might be on, those too are very rare cases. So whatever exceptions there may be, even according to the lenient views, would be very rare. And once we have a significant view, a noteworthy view, including that of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was a world-recognized halachic authority. He passed away in 1985. He writes in his Responsa Igros Moshe in Kosher Mishpat, second volume, in several Responsa, including 69 and 83, that this is, namely abortion, is bloodshed. So even if it was just his view, and it's not just his view, but even that if he was the only one to articulate that position, once we're discussing a issue of murder, we have to give significant weight even to an individual view, a das yochid, certainly in this case when it's more than just that. So even if there are other views that have more lenient positions, but when we're talking about murder, we have to account for those that consider it murder, even if there are more views that hold it's not murder. Practically speaking, from a Jewish perspective, there's really not much to talk about. Certainly, any exceptions that there may be, even if they would be somehow relevant in contemporary society, would not be any justification whatsoever to allow the mass murder of babies through abortion on demand or anything close to it. So that the notion that abortion on demand has some basis in Judaism is absolutely demonstrably false. There's not a scintilla of evidence supporting that, even according to the most lenient views within what we would consider normative Torah or halachic thought. And that debunks what we hear from people that may identify as Orthodox and may even be Orthodox. The fact that they are Orthodox or call themselves that doesn't negate the fact that there is no basis within authentic Judaism to support a policy of abortion on demand or anything close thereto. In fact, the truth is that what is worse than 62 million babies being killed? What's worse is the legitimization of killing babies, which perpetuates it. And the legitimization is something that is being advanced by people with agendas. They are exploiting the name of Judaism and even the name of Orthodox Judaism, but by simply unmasking them as frauds, we can do a great service and blunt their effectiveness. Rav Aaron Kotler in Mishnah Rabbanan, the citation is 1, 2, 3, 6 states that the greatest threat to Judaism is not hatred of Jews, often referred to as anti-Semitism. It's not even assimilation. It's the distortion of the Torah. So unfortunately, in every movement that is promoting evil, there is some attempt to exploit the Torah or Torah sources to make it appear as if somehow the Torah gives a green light to whatever particular evil that they are trying to advance. And we should be aware of that and on guard whenever we hear this type of propaganda. There are ways to respond to it. They do not involve unnecessarily developing an expertise in the field. Just to be aware of the fact that there are on record multiple Torah sources that make it very clear that, again, there is no basis whatsoever, even according to the most lenient opinions, to allow any sort of policy, anything close to abortion on demand. And again, even the primary exception that really merits a discussion, which is the danger of mother's life, that's really off the table because of modern medical advances. And furthermore, I don't foresee that exception being eliminated in legislation in the foreseeable future in the United States, especially given where the culture is now. Not only do I not foresee it, the RCA, those are more modern Orthodox rabbis, back in 1972, they unanimously, I think it was 80-0, they unanimously, their leading rabbis called for abortion repeal, meaning there was an abortion bill passed in New York State in 1970. They unanimously called for its appeal. They were around when the abortion ban was in effect. All these chicken little scenarios that these people, these Johnny-come-latelys are worried about, they were there when that was something to be worried about, if there would have been anything to be worried about. And they unanimously called for the repeal of the abortion law. Again, this was in 1972. I would also like to add that Rabbi Feinstein called legislator Paul Bookson, representing the Lower East Side, where he lived, in 1972. Bookson had voted yes, unfortunately, for the abortion law in 1970. He voted no in 72, and that was because Rabbi Moshe Feinstein personally called him. And I know that because a contributor to the Jewish press, whom I know personally, was there in the room, even though Mr. Bookson gave some other convoluted argument as to why he changed his vote, but that was the reason, because Rabbi Moshe Feinstein himself called him. And that shows what we as Jews are supposed to be doing. We are charged with engaging in the culture to the extent that we need to stand up for what's right and defend the most innocent and stand up for the honor of Torah and its adherents as well, not to allow others to speak in our name and to be a light to the nations. Now, I wanted to address a different aspect from the Torah perspective, if I may, which is that up till now we're talking about the act of abortion, which often is considered or committed by individuals because of difficult circumstances. That's not justified. That's just to explain that a lot of times women are in situations where they feel compelled due to lack of known alternatives to them to abort the baby, or because they just feel that having a baby gets in the way of their immoral lifestyle. Whatever the case may be, even in the worst case scenario, there's a benefit, real or perceived, for which they do or commit abortion. However, the struggle that we are encountering in society now has extended far beyond that. We're not dealing with people that are just engaging in sinful behavior for personal benefit. We're talking about an entire movement dedicated to promoting the legitimization of abortion. And that raises this struggle to an entirely different plateau of wickedness. This is what we could identify as righteous wickedness lahachas, for spite, as opposed to evil or wickedness for benefit, the te'ovam. And that distinction is actually brought out in this week's parsha at the very end, in the reference to the eradication of Amalek at the end of Parshas Kiseitzei, and at the end of the 25th chapter of Dvarim that we read this week, and we also read it the times, and some read it every day, in fact, because it's a commandment to remember what Amalek did to us and to recognize the spirit of Amalek, the spiritual Amalek influences in every generation. We're talking about the persona, the paradigm of Amalek right now. We're not talking about individuals. And the idea of promoting wickedness for the sake of wickedness, promoting sin for the sake of sin, that's a concept of rebellion, which Amalek personified. And that is embodied in the movements that are promoting abortion as a right and as something to be celebrated, as in the Shout Out Your Abortion movement that's germinated recently. You know, people may remember that Bill Clinton ran on keeping abortion safe, legal, and rare. New York Governor Hochul, in contrast, is running on keeping abortion safe, legal, and accessible. So they're upping the ante. They're making it an ideal rather than something that should be minimized. And to promote this type of wickedness, victimizing en masse an entire category, the most innocent, most defenseless human beings, to make that an ideal, that requires a level of evil that most people can't even really grasp. But that's what we're encountering. So when we talk about the abortion movement, we're not talking about individuals that succumb to their inclination to take the lower moral ground when it comes to a hard choice that they face. We're talking about people that are promoting evil, that are trying to legitimize evil and perpetuate it. And that movement should be treated as such. I'd like to end off with mentioning, with respect to Israel, where over 2 million Jewish babies have been killed by our own, so to speak, more than were killed by Hitler through abortion. We essentially need public awareness to the extent that no political party worth its weight that calls itself religious would ignore the issue and fail to fight against the more or less de facto abortion on demand that exists in that country in open contravention of Torah law, despite the fact that they call them a Jewish state. There are very few things that are run Jewishly, and the policy on abortion is one of the things that is clearly a very anti-Jewish position. The way to change that, perhaps practically speaking, in addition to awareness, but another practical policy change, which actually could have a tremendous impact and something that the country is ripe for and would probably stick and not be overturned by a subsequent left-wing government, would be to eliminate the female draft, because the drafting of women, unfortunately, also rampant in Israel, and clear contravention of Torah law and basic human decency, that drafting of women policy advances abortion by bringing in many women who otherwise would get married. It brings them into the abortion culture, and unfortunately, once they're in that culture, they don't leave it when they leave the army. And by stopping the government from forcing these women into that immoral, corrosive, corrupt, exploitive environment of the military, that itself will save many of these women from the abortion culture. The exemption of women from all women, not just religious women, but all women from the draft, is a policy that actually has a lot of broad support across political and social lines in Israel. And that's something that would probably stick and be hard even for the ultra left-wing Supreme Court to overturn, given the popular support for that. And that's one practical policy shift that I think could actually make a serious dent in abortions in the short and long term. So with that, I'd like to close. Thank you for your attention. And if anyone would like to contact us, feel free to call or text 845-642-1679 with your details. Thank you so much.